Welcome to Know My Faith. My guest this time is Dorothy Findlay, who has a fascinating life that I'm looking forward to finding more about. She's written this book, her autobiography, Leapfrogging for God. Dorothy, thank you for joining us.
I'm very welcome.
Now, your life has been all over the place, which we're going to get to, but go back to as early as you can remember with you and Jesus. Did you grow up in a Christian family?
I was grown up in a Christian family who had a very strong mission motivation. My uncle was a missionary in Singapore, particularly reaching the Malays, and I was interested in that. But from the age of 5, I knew that God would want me to be a nurse and to tell people about Jesus. That was the simplest definition I could give.
From the age of 5?
From the age of 5. I was in hospital and I had collapsed lungs following being in plaster cast for nearly 4 years as a problem with my hips. So I was not a candidate that one would expect to go overseas, but I knew God, and it gave me a determination to see step by step the Lord leading me.
Did you go straight into the nursing thing when you left school?
Yes, I knew I was going to be a nurse. And when I got to the end of my secondary schooling, I got my university entrance, which was in itself a miracle. And I was sent to the hospital to have an interview, and they said, well, we don't think you'll be able to walk well enough.
Right.
I said, yes, I can. God wants me to be a nurse, so I'll be a nurse. And they gave me a chance to try. Yeah. And the first 3 months was really hard work. And one day the matron came into me and said, Nurse Findlay, she said, I'm sorry, but you're going to have 2 weeks off on sick leave, and we're going to assess your future from there. So I thought to myself, what shall I do? I shall become a dental nurse. I'll be able to sit on a chair, won't have to walk all this, won't have to lift the heavy people. So that's what I planned to do. I went to physio. They gave me 2 weeks physio. And one day in the second week, I remember as clear as daylight, as the Lord was speaking to me today. I was going up the nurse's home corridor, up the stairs, and the Lord said to me, what right have you got to change my plans for your life?
That is so, I was talking to somebody last night at a Bible study in a backpackers, and we were talking about those first recorded words of Satan in Scripture. Has God said? And that's like for you, has God really said you're supposed to be a nurse? Maybe you need to change his plan to be a dental nurse.
Well, I knew then that I had the application papers ready to take to the post office at that time, and I couldn't somehow get around to doing it.
Yep.
And I realised that I was doing that exact thing. What happened is that on the Friday morning I went into the matron to get my outcome at the end of my second week, and she said, well, I've just talked to Dr. Coates-Milson, he's the orthopaedic man, and he said Nurse Findlay is motivated to be a nurse, she shall be allowed to continue. And I found out many years later that that date when the Lord spoke to me on the stairs was the very day that he had written to the matron and said I should be allowed to continue.
So did you have like the faith struggles with that, saying I thought you'd called me to this?
No, not at all. I just knew instantly that I was on the wrong track and that I had to go back. And when I was told by the matron that she'd give me light work, I wouldn't have the heavy lifting and stuff like that.
So, I mean, you went from there to missions in many different countries.
I had quite a lot of preparation. I went and did my midwifery training because I was particularly interested in Afghanistan at the time. And I thought it would be useful to deliver babies.
Yep.
And then I went to London and did a course in eye nursing because there's a lot of eye disease in Afghanistan. And when I came back, I was with my particular denomination that they said, well, we can't commend you as a missionary because you can't start churches and you can't do all kinds of things like that. So I thought, here am I. They'd told me they would do it, and here was I. Now, 24, well-qualified, well-trained, ready to go, and I couldn't go. So it happened that Derek Prince was in Tauranga. I thought, I'm going to slip in and see whether this is the devil or not. And so I went, and for 9 months I went out to the AOG on the Sunday night and the Brethren in the morning. And the Lord just clearly showed me and gave me a very specific experience in the baptism of the Holy Spirit, which changed my whole outlook.
So this was just a case of having to wait now?
Yes, it was probably about 2.5 years before. One day I was I was in Wellesley Street Methodist Church. They had a missions display from different missions. And one of them had a mission statement saying that they were interested in Muslims for 1971.
Yep.
And my ears just pricked up. And I thought, this is WEC, I know WEC. So I, that day, wrote to the leadership
Yep.
and arranged that weekend to go down and see them. And I went into candidates course that July. So
Excellent.
it was very quick.
The amazing thing, I first knew you through Prayer for Israel.
That's right,
where
yeah.
I first came across your name, and you still run a Prayer for
I'm still
Israel
a member of the group, yeah.
But you spent a lot of your time in Muslim countries.
Yes, well, God called me to Muslim countries initially, and I didn't ever imagine that I was going to do anything else but serve Him in the back blocks or somewhere.
Yep.
Well, when I came to go, Mr. Davies, the director, he said to me, Dorothy, he said, are you sure you should be going to Afghanistan? And I said, well, funnily you say mention it, when you were brought to our attention in about halfway through the course that there was need to set up a hospital in Yemen, in North Yemen, in Sada. And we had been invited to go and do it.
Now, what year is this? Because
this is 1971.
Because Yemen used to have a very large Jewish population.
It did. It had, and the Jewish people there were there from the days of Solomon, really.
Yes, yeah.
And when I went there, I didn't meet them at first. I saw these young men coming into the clinic with long curls and so forth, and I didn't know who they were, but they told me they were Yehudi, which is the way Arabic speakers say Jews. And then we got to know some Yemeni Jewish women. I went to a wedding and I went to a Passover service, and I learned about these people. They were living a totally Jewish lifestyle in the middle of an Arabic Islamic society, and they were well respected at that time.
Yes.
Now most everybody has left the country. But I never really thought of myself going to work with the Jewish people or anything like that, but I was fascinated by the fact that now I'd had a privilege of meeting up with some of Solomon's friends.
Yeah. You must have a not unique perspective, but for most of us who haven't worked with Jewish people or Muslim people or Arab people, you must have an interesting perspective on, and we'll use the word on the three faiths. We know it's two, but was that a slow process of coming to know?
I went through Bible college in New Zealand and did a missions course with emphasis on Islam. And so my time in Yemen, which was 7 years, I learned Arabic. I learned to live among a non-aggressive Arab society because I had never seen Christians before. And so we were able to introduce gradually little aspects of Christian life, but we were told by the government we weren't allowed to practice our religion. We were allowed to practice our religion, but we weren't allowed to convert.
Yes, yeah.
So I really felt by the time God told me it was time, He literally told me overnight that it was time to leave Yemen, and He had other things for me to do. And I just knew that He had used this time. It had trained me in the Arabic language, it had trained me to meet Jewish people in the indigenous environment, it had trained me to all the medical aspects and living in a very primitive society. So it was really like a backdrop training for what God had for me in store.
And what was that?
Well, I went back to New Zealand and I was nursing, and one day the pastor of our Assembly Church, God's Church, where I went, said to me, Dorothy, time for you to go back to the mission field, isn't it?
How old were you then?
33.
33, yeah.
And I thought, well, where could I go? And immediately dropped into my mind Dr. Rajamani, an Indian AOG pastor. He'd been in Tauranga. And I said I'd like to go and help him. I had no interest in India at all, but I just knew that was the direction. So I went there for 3 months. While I was in the balcony of his house, typing up some notes for him, the Lord said to me, I want you to go to Egypt. And I thought, people are going to think I'm completely mad when I go home to New Zealand and say, no, I had 3 months in India, now I want to go to Egypt.
Yeah, can't you make up your mind?
Yeah, that's exactly right. What could I do in Egypt? I said, Lord, there's a fleece here. When I go back to New Zealand, people are saying to me that we had some contact with Egypt in the recent past. I wouldn't take it that was a direction that the Lord was pointing me.
Yep.
And lo and behold, I came back home, and the first Sunday I went to everybody. We were meeting in the town hall.
Yeah.
I was so excited. They said, Dorothy, we've had a pastor from Cairo
Oh, my
come and
goodness.
speak last week.
Yeah.
I thought, goodness, it couldn't have been any more accurate. So I took a few weeks to tell the pastor, and then he said, oh, great idea. I'll write to him and see if he can use you in Cairo. So that's what happened. I eventually went to Cairo. I went just really as a helper, working with the Arab church, the Egyptian church.
So this is with the Coptic Church?
No, it was the Egyptian Assembly of God church,
Okay.
actually.
Yep.
And well, first of all, it was the Church of Christ, and they introduced me to the pastor, young pastor, who again, quite miraculously, came up to me. We had to go to a conference in Cairo when I first went there, and I met this pastor that was coming from America, and he said, I told the pastor of Church of Christ that you're available. So I was expecting him maybe to come and tell me, give me a job to do, something like that. And nothing happened. One day went by, second conference day went by, third conference day went by. And just at the end of the third day, the young Egyptian pastor who was translating for him, he came in and he said, do you take ladies' meetings? Now, I had dressed up like a Muslim woman. I didn't realise I was not a Muslim woman, but I thought, well, I had my head covered, had a long dress and long sleeves, and I I was particularly correct. But unfortunately, it's not how the Christian Christian Arabs dress.
Right.
And so he said, I was very afraid, but God told me, go and ask her if she takes ladies' meetings. So it began 2.5 months of intensive preaching.
Had you done that before?
No. I've done almost everything in my life, never having done it before.
Did you hear God chuckling in the background?
I'm sure he was, but I was too busy thinking about what I had to do.
Dorothy, if you only knew what I have planned for you.
Exactly. Well, that was only the beginning, really, of my life, because I was there in 1981, and November 81, 3 times in a row, God woke me up from deep sleep to say, I want you to go to the place I put my name. And knowing the Bible, it says in Deuteronomy, about 3 chapters, it says, go to the place that I put my name.
Yes.
So I thought the only place I could think of is Jerusalem. So I ran 2 or 3 weeks later and packed my bags, went to Jerusalem by bus over the Sinai Peninsula. And it was like the spies spying out the land. I had 6 weeks. I stayed with a Christian group in Jerusalem. We went up to the Negev. We went down to Negev, went up to Lebanon, all over the place. And I had amazing opportunities. And I saw St. John Eye Hospital there.
Yeah.
And I thought, eyes. I've got training in eyes.
I've trained
Maybe
in
God
that,
could bring me back. So I came back to New Zealand for 3 years and was AOG Church secretary for 3 years. And one afternoon, God spoke to me. He said, it's time to go back to Israel, contact St. John's and get a job.
Yep.
So I did. And so in 1985, I went back to Jerusalem and I started nursing in St. John Eye Hospital. It's an Arab hospital which has got half Arabic Christians and half Arabic Muslims. So it was a good environment. And I had 1 year there, and the Lord led me to work with the Arab Baptist Church. They were very astonished.
In Jerusalem?
In Jerusalem, yes.
Okay.
They were very astonished that a foreigner, and they called me a blue-eyed blonde, because I'm quite blonde compared with their dark skin, and that I understood their songs and I could worship. And an interesting thing was that the pastor was from Egypt, so I understood the dialect. Gradually, I began to get to know some friends that were working among the Jewish people, and it was difficult to work with the Jews and the Arabs in Jerusalem, simply because Christians met on Sunday, and Jews met on Saturday, and Muslims met on Friday.
Yeah.
So you could spend almost half a week going to the different churches. So I had to make my mind up, and some of them were very suspicious of me. Some of the Jewish people were, why was I interested in the Arabs?
The Arab Christians met on Friday?
No, they met on Sunday.
They meet on Sunday. Okay.
Yes,
Yeah.
they met on Sunday. So you had Muslims on Friday,
Muslims on Friday.
Jews on Saturday, and Christians on Sunday. And I was attending this Christian church, so I was involved in Sunday. When I began to get to know some Jewish people, I found the most fascinating thing that they were interested in was the fact that I'd worked with Yemeni Jews.
Right.
It may be one of them, even though I was, I could not speak much more than a few words in Hebrew at that time. Toward 87, I worked in Bethlehem University, training nurses there, but the first Intifada came along, and they closed the university down. I lived in Jerusalem and had to travel backwards and forwards, so I couldn't travel backwards and forwards. So I thought, what will I do? And I began to pray about it, and the Lord said, go to work in Hadassah. Hadassah is a big Jewish hospital.
Yes.
A very big hospital, 1,500 beds, and it's a major training school in Israel, in Jerusalem. And so I had a nursing friend, a Christian friend who was working there. She said, we need someone that could work with the Arabic people, because at that time, people from Gaza were coming up from Jerusalem for surgery and for treatment. And many of them had their grandparents with them. And they said, we need someone that can translate and work with the Arabs just as well as the Jews. So I started the process of getting a job.
With nursing knowledge as well.
Nursing knowledge too. At first they said, no, we can't give it to you. You've got to write to the New Zealand police and get a clearance.
Okay.
So I did that, and they said, no, we can't give you a clearance. We can only give it to the Ministry of Interior. And so I went to them, and they said, well, we can't do that. So
well, they'd have no idea who you were. You barely spent any time in New Zealand.
I'd been in Jerusalem long enough to go to the Israeli police. And I went to the Israeli police for clearance, and they said, no, we can't do that.
Oh.
We can only do the other. And this went on backwards and forwards for about 6 weeks, quite amazingly, really. And at the end of 6 weeks, I got a reply back from the Ombudsman in New Zealand that the only proof he could give of my integrity was that I had no driver's license infringement.
Right.
So that was no use to the Ministry of Interior. So I went back to them and said, look, I'm stuck. Here I've got a job waiting for me. They want me to nurse, and I can't get to it because you won't give me the work permit. Oh, they said, are you like the British? Oh, I said, yes, New Zealand government is just like the British government. Now, give or take a little bit. And I said, oh, well, we've been put in an awkward spot. It's because all the British consulate staff, we asked them to get clearances, and the Foreign Office would not give them clearances. So we had to give them a visa.
Okay.
So
you got a
visa. Next day I started working at Hadassah. So it was an interesting time. I worked for nearly 2 years in Hadassah. And first of all, I lived in the old city with an Arab lady and used to come across by bus overnight. It was quite a long way from the old city over to Ankara.
Yep.
Anyway, I thought the Lord wanted me to get to know him closer, the Jewish lifestyle. So I asked them if they could put me in an accommodation close on the Jewish side. So I did nearly 9 months living there.
What was your understanding of the connection with Christianity and Judaism in those days? Because I know you have a very clear understanding now.
Well, I had a very good Bible teaching and training in youth, and I was aware that certain terms that we use in Christianity did not mean the same thing either in Jews or Muslims. And you had to be careful and cautious, and that going bang into it by telling them that giving your heart to Jesus makes absolutely no sense whatsoever to a Jewish person, because they don't understand the concept, anything like that. And I realised that I was gradually getting to know the Hebrew Scriptures more. I began to learn a little bit of Hebrew, and I felt that those Christians that were effective in Israel were the ones who went alongside the Jewish people rather than at them.
Yes. Yeah.
This is a very important thing. And many times I heard stories of people, accosting Jews. And this is not not the way to do it.
No.
Nor is it really what God would do, because the Lord, even the Lord himself, he worked with the people and walked alongside them. So for both Jews and Arabs, it's much the same principle, but they're from a different angle.
It's very bad sales technique. I mean, you've been to Israel a number of times. We've only been once, but you walk down, is it St. David Street in the old city with the hawkers on both sides. Oh, you need to buy this, you need to buy this, buy this, buy this. And it completely puts you off. And from a non-believer's point of view, if the Christian is coming in saying, you need to believe this, you need to believe this, it's so off-putting.
Well, you see, the Jews have a long history of Christian anti-Semitism.
Yes.
We don't think of it as that. We don't know that.
We don't know it.
In our church history, we're not taught it, and so they don't realise that when you approach a Jewish person, they are very, very alert to the possibility that you're trying to get them.
Yeah.
And the main way to reach them is by friendship.
Yeah.
It's simple friendship evangelism, a one-to-one. It's not something, Christians in the West have large crusades and things like that. None of that kind of style of ministry is effective either with the Arab or the Jew.
Because when we look particularly at European history with the Jewish, it was forced conversion.
That's right.
And so many of them, and I remember reading a story recently of a family where the father said, we are going to convert to Christianity because it's safer for us.
Well, many Jews did give a semblance of conversion for their protection, those in Spain and other countries where they're under great persecution. But on the whole, I would say that majority of them kept kosher. They kept the Sabbat.
Very quietly.
And they kept Passover.
Yeah.
And Yom Kippur. And did it in such a way that it was not, made sure the curtains were closed and that sort of thing.
So how did you find it as working with, and I don't want to be, it's not like subversive fifth column in the background with these Jewish people, but obviously you're a Christian, obviously you'd like to see these Orthodox and secular Jewish people coming to know their Messiah. How did you find that?
Well, for myself personally, I didn't have the privilege of actually leading any Jewish person to the Lord, but I have the privilege of getting to know some quite eminent Jews. And one day I had read on the internet, an Arab Shiva, an Israeli newspaper, that this man, Yehuda Glick, was going to give his job up in the Ministry of Ashkelon, and because the time in 2005 when they had the disengagement from Gaza,
yes,
his wife's brother was a rabbi there, and so he said, he wrote in this letter that he was going to trust the God of Israel to give him a suitable work. And something in the expression "trust the God of Israel" made me think, oh, I should write and talk to him. So I did, and I sent him a Purim package. It happened to be over the end of March when they celebrate Purim. I sent a Purim package via the internet and a message with my email address. And he wrote me back a astonished letter. And that began quite a strong friendship. And to this day, I met up with his wife and his family. I met up with his mother. And the mother, why I'm telling you this is because his mother, the first time he met me, spent 2.5 hours drilling me as to whether I was going to be preaching at his son or not.
Yeah.
And so she was quite satisfied that I was not. And yet the thing is, they need to be taught from the Old Testament. Now, I think this is a great mistake that most Christians have, that they don't realise that the Old Testament, because it's called the Old Testament, it was only called Old Testament by Jesuit priests in 12th century AD. Prior to that, it was the Brit Hadashah, which is the New Testament attached to the Old Testament in one book.
Yes.
And of course, the Jews, they don't recognise the New Testament as such. But the gospel is explained explicitly in the Old Testament.
Isn't that what Paul did? Paul went round all the
That's right, he
synagogues
taught them.
teaching from, he didn't teach from the New Testament because he wrote half of it.
Because
He taught
the
from the Old
Jews,
Testament.
they don't really need to be converted. They have to have their eyes open to the
Yes,
Messiah.
yeah.
There's a very big difference. They don't need to be made to become Christians.
I remember sitting in a home group one time, and one of the new members in the church was talking to an older Fijian Indian man, and he asked his conversion story because he came out of the Hindu. And I said, you know, what we do is we want to see Hindus convert to Christianity. We want to see Muslims convert to Christianity. We want to see atheists convert. We want to see Buddhists convert. We want to see Jews convert. Whoa, stop. That's wrong. You know, the Jews don't need to convert. It's their religion that we're actually joining.
Yes, that's right.
with.
That's the big thing that Paul brought out in Romans, and that we're being grafted into the olive tree, which is Israel.
Yeah.
Now, some people today look on Israel and they see it as a secular country and so many issues that not much different from everywhere else. But in God's eyes, they are special to him. And back in Numbers, I think it's 23, something like that, where Balak was asked to curse
Yes.
the children of Israel. And he said, but I see a nation, a people apart over that are separate. And these are what the problem with the Jewish people throughout their centuries is that they wanted to be like the nations so that they're not discriminated against.
That's right, yeah. But they can't be because they're God's special
and
people.
Every time they've tried,
Yeah.
there's been problems. So
And we forget about the fact that even in the Old Testament, when we look at the nations of Israel and Judah as separate nations, they weren't always, and Israel in particular was never a godly nation.
No.
Judah was sometimes godly under the good kings and sometimes very, very secular and evil, and yet they were still God's people, and yet those nations that came against Israel or Judah were still punished by God for coming against his people. So if we look at the modern state of Israel, you go, no, it's not God honoring. It's a secular. I mean, Tel Aviv is the. Let's not say anything. But it's But it's still Israel. It's still God's chosen people.
God's chosen people because they are like a litmus paper of God's purposes for the world.
Yeah.
And even most Jews don't want to be chosen at all, because they realise that it's the chosenness that makes the problem for
That's
them.
what Tevye says in Fiddler on the Roof, isn't it? He says, just once, couldn't you choose somebody else?
That's right, absolutely is.
How do you find it with when you're talking with people? Because I know at the moment you're fellowshipping at an Anglican church. You've been through various different denominations or around different denominations. How do you find it when you're talking to New Zealand Christians about Israel? What's the reaction?
Most are abysmally ignorant, because there's a real problem in today in recognising that the Israel of today is the same Israel as of the Bible. That because the Palestinians and the Arab have done such a good job of convincing the world that these Jews had run away from the Holocaust and they've stolen their land.
Yep.
That this is the narrative that is majority, even Christians understand. Now, if you're talking it from the Bible, they can understand it perfectly, but they're talking about it from the real people, they can't see any connection. And I think this is something that's really important. Why I mentioned the question of the Old and New Testament is because many of the errors, like replacement theology, supersessionism, comes from the fact that they see that the Jews rejected Jesus, and of course he must have rejected them.
Yeah.
But there's no implication in that, because Paul said, no, they're not rejected, but they're beloved for the patriarch's sake.
God forbid, he says.
God forbid, because for the patriarch's sake. And this is an important thing. And so those chapters of 9, 10 and 11 in Romans, I don't think many people understand them at all, but unless they really see them as Paul teaching the Roman church about the Jewish people, and that this is what happens. So Gentiles are born again, they're born into the family of God, and they are grafted into the olive tree. Now the Jews, if they They don't know that they're in that olive tree for a long time, but
Yeah.
when they do, they just recognise, it's a matter of recognising the Messiah. They have to know. And, you know, when the Lord says he's going to come back and they're going to say, Baruch haba b'shem Adonai, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, that terminology does not fit with the
No.
Christian, I've got to be saved kind of image.
Yeah.
But it's how God looks on his people.
Yeah.
And he looks on them, and he looks on the Gentile Christians and judges them on their attitude to the Jews, because there's not much difference between.
Well, that's very much the sheep and the goats, isn't it? Whatever
very
you've done
much
to the
so.
least of these, my brethren.
That's right. Of course, in Israel now there are probably about 30,000 Messianic believers or believers in Yeshua, who's a Hebrew name for Jesus. And many don't like the name Messianic, but on the whole, it's the name that's given to distinguish them from every other kind of Judaism.
So when you're talking with, if we go back to the Kiwis, when you're talking with them, how many of them get it? Or are they closed, you know, there's the arms folded and
let me
don't
take
want
the
to know?
experience of going to this Holy Trinity Church, which is an Anglican church, and I went there because God told me he wanted me to go there for two reasons. He wanted me to establish prayer groups for Israel, and he wanted me to be involved in a future revival, if there was such a, that he was going to bring. So I began to, at first people were a bit suspicious of me because I came from a Pentecostal background.
Yep.
But then they saw that I was quite safe. And gradually I said to the pastor, I said, could I have a time for a special prayer group for Israel, prayer for Israel? And he gave me the freedom to be part of a life group that runs that. So that has been running now since probably about 2012.
Okay.
And we have about 12, 15 people come. And I also am on the intercessory program where once a week, once a month or so, I get a chance to read intercessory prayers. And I always include praying for the peace in Jerusalem. So gradually people have begun to look on Dorothy as the Jewish girl, as the person who's you know, any go-to person for Israel. And gradually there's been a great warmth. Many people from the Holy Trinity have been to Israel now, and including the vicars that were previous vicars. The next one is coming in the 26th of June, and I wouldn't be surprised if he isn't very open to Israel. He's been through Faith Bible College, I understand, and so we'll just see what happens. I think, on the whole, people are interested. If I worked in a supermarket and talked about Israel, they'd be interested because of the history of what I've been up to there.
Yes.
I was looking after children with heart surgery and all kinds of interesting things. So gradually see them as not the evil intention. Or I'll tell, if I think they're very aggressive to the Jews, I'll tell them about something to do with the Arabs. That's a blessing.
Yeah.
And I know several Arab pastors who are very, very evangelical, and they love the Jewish people.
Yes.
And they meet together regularly for prayer and fellowship. So there's not us and them in the real body of Christ.
As I mentioned before, when we were there, the fellowship the church that we were associated with had moved into a new building, and Yossi Ovadia, who was the leader of the fellowship, and Anis, I can't remember Anis's surname, but he is an Arab Christian pastor, and both of them came together to plant an olive tree to say, we are brothers, we worship the same God.
That's right.
Although I know there's a different dynamic there for the Arab believers, because you have to
Gentiles.
say, I'm a Gentile Arab worshipping the Jewish God.
That's right.
In Israel, in the land of Israel.
It's a very wonderful arrangement.
What would you say to somebody who's either watching this podcast or listening to this podcast, just to somebody who is a Christian, to get them on the road to understanding Israel and understanding the Jewishness of our faith?
I think it's very important that they understand and read the Old Testament, particularly the prophets. The current environment in which we live in today fits very well into Ezekiel from 33 through to 39.
Yeah.
And there's many things that are similar. There's Psalm 83, which talks about the nations around about Jerusalem, Israel wanting to destroy, and say that Israel is no longer a people, and these kind of things. It's very important to understand that God's covenants are never change. But the one in particular, one made with with Abraham, is unconditional.
Yes.
Because it was cut, as it's described in the Bible, on the basis that Abraham was in a deep sleep. So he had no part in the decision making.
Unconditional and everlasting.
Everlasting, that's right. And but there are covenants which seem to be conditional because they're conditional on the fulfillment of the blessings of Israel.
Yeah.
Are dependent on their obedience. And so throughout history, you've got stories of people following God and then turning away, following and turning away, no different from what is happening today.
Yeah.
And yet in Ezekiel, it talks very clearly that at the end time, God is still the God of the Jews, and the Gentiles are grafted into that.
Grafted in with the Jews,
and so,
to the promises.
Part of the problem with the replacement theology is the fact that they don't believe that God is still saving the Jews.
Yeah.
Because the Christians have taken over, but there's nothing in the Bible to suggest that.
No, you've got to bring that, and that's that supersessionism. You've got to bring that into the Bible.
Well, there's lots of doctrines, and there's quite a few key Bible teachers that unfortunately follow that line.
Yeah.
And they are very ineffective. I knew people in Bethlehem Bible College, which is a particular headquarters of supersessionist theory, and I used to go there. I knew the lecturers and the pastor there that judged, and it really concerned me because they could not see anything now to do good about the Jews. They would officially be quite good, but in their heart, one in particular pastor, his family, they were under some certain problems with the initiation of the State of Israel. There were certain problems and people lost their homes and things like that. But it's built into him a bitter spirit. Yes. And that bitter spirit hinders the ministry.
Yeah. Dorothy, look, thank you so much for sharing with us.
Oh, is that much?
We've talked for almost an hour. So it's been great, and I hope that people have listened to what you said and maybe opened their spirits, if you will, or their minds to searching a little bit deeper and finding out a little bit more. That's right.
Well, I think it's very important to have an open heart and to love people. I mean, the scripture says that God's love is shed abroad in our hearts. And if his love is shed abroad in our hearts, it reaches to everybody, Jew and Gentile.
So if you'd like a copy of the book, then click the link below, which will give you the details of that. Dorothy, thank you for your time.
You're welcome.
And thank you for watching, and thank you for listening. If you'd like to find out more, simply follow us on Facebook or subscribe on YouTube, or go to our website, which is knowmyfaith.net. God bless you.